I've been investigating cold cases for over 15 years, and I can tell you that some mysteries stick with you long after you close the file. The Scott family case is one of those mysteries. It's December 1999, and everyone's talking about Y2K, the new millennium, the end of the world as we know it. But for the Scotts, the world would end much sooner than anyone expected. I remember the first time I read their case file. 4 people don't just vanish into thin air, especially not a family with strong community ties and no history of running away. Yet that's exactly what happened to Michael and Sarah Scott and their 8-year-old twins, Emma and Jake. The Scotts lived in Cedar Rapids, a quiet suburb where everyone knew everyone else's business. Michael worked as an accountant for a local firm, methodical and reliable, the type of man who never missed a deadline or forgot an anniversary. Sarah was a part-time teacher at the elementary school, beloved by her students and colleagues alike. She had this way of making every child feel special, like they were the most important person in her world. The twins were typical 8-year-olds, full of energy and curiosity. Emma was the quieter one, always reading or drawing in her notebook, while Jake was the adventurer, constantly exploring the neighborhood and bringing home interesting rocks or insects he'd found. In late December 1999, the Scotts decided to do something they'd never done before: rent a cabin in the mountains for New Year's Eve. Sarah had been stressed about her mother's recent cancer diagnosis, and Michael thought a change of scenery would do them all good. They found a remote cabin about 3 hours north of Cedar Rapids, nestled in the Cascade Mountains. The listing described it as the perfect family retreat, with hiking trails, a stone fireplace, and complete privacy. What it didn't mention was how isolated it really was, or how the cell phone coverage was practically non-existent in that area. I've driven to that cabin myself, following the same route the Scotts took 12 years ago. The road winds through dense forest, and as you climb higher, the trees seem to close in around you. There are no other houses for miles, no convenience stores, no gas stations, just endless wilderness stretching in every direction. It's beautiful in a way, but there's something unsettling about the silence, the way sound seems to disappear into the forest. The cabin itself sits on a small clearing, built from dark wood that has weathered to an almost black color over the years. There's a covered porch that wraps around the front, and large windows that offer a view of the mountains beyond. The Scotts arrived at the cabin on December 30th, 1999, in the early afternoon. I know this because Michael used his credit card to buy groceries and supplies at a small market about 20 miles from the cabin. The store clerk, Martha Henderson, remembered them clearly. She told me Michael seemed cheerful, talking about showing the kids a real mountain Christmas. Sarah bought ingredients for hot chocolate and s'mores, and the twins were excited about the possibility of snow. Martha said they seemed like any other happy family on vacation. That was the last confirmed sighting of the Scott family alive. According to the rental agreement, the Scotts were supposed to check out by noon on January 2nd, 2000. When they didn't show up or call, the property manager, Robert Chen, drove up to the cabin to check on them. He found the front door unlocked, the family's belongings scattered throughout the house, but no sign of the Scotts themselves. Their car was parked in the driveway, keys still in the ignition. Inside the cabin, it looked like they had simply stepped outside for a moment and never returned. There were partially unpacked suitcases in the bedrooms, Emma's drawing pad open on the coffee table with a half-finished sketch of a mountain landscape, and Jake's hiking boots by the front door, laces untied. The kitchen told its own story. Dishes from what appeared to be breakfast were still in the sink, and there were 4 mugs on the counter with cold coffee and hot chocolate residue. A pot of oatmeal sat on the stove, now hard and congealed. In the living room, a board game was set up on the coffee table, pieces scattered as if the game had been interrupted mid-play. Sarah's purse was on the kitchen counter with her wallet, ID, and credit cards still inside. Michael's briefcase sat by the front door, and both parents' cell phones were charging on the nightstand in the master bedroom. Whatever had caused the Scotts to leave the cabin, they hadn't planned to be gone for long. The local sheriff's department treated it as a missing persons case from the beginning, but they were ill-equipped to handle an investigation of this magnitude. The lead investigator was Deputy Sheriff Tom Bradley, a good man, but someone whose experience was limited to petty theft and domestic disputes. He started by organizing search parties, bringing in volunteers from the nearest town to comb the surrounding forest. They searched for weeks, using bloodhounds and volunteers on horseback, covering hundreds of acres of rugged terrain. The dogs picked up the family's scent, leading away from the cabin, but the trail went cold about a quarter-mile into the forest, near a rocky outcropping that locals called Devil's Point. The lack of physical evidence was baffling. 4 people don't just disappear without leaving some trace behind, especially when 2 of them are 8-year-old children. The searchers found no clothing, no footprints, no signs of a struggle. It was as if the Scott family had simply ceased to exist. The weather conditions didn't help either. A heavy snowfall on January 3rd covered any potential evidence that might have been left behind. By the time the snow melted in the spring, any clues that might have survived the winter were long gone. As news of the disappearance spread, theories began to emerge. Some people believed the family had staged their own disappearance, perhaps to escape financial troubles or legal problems. But investigators found no evidence of debts or criminal activity. The Scotts' bank accounts were healthy, they had no enemies that anyone could identify, and their life in Cedar Rapids seemed genuinely happy. Others suggested they might have encountered wildlife, bears or mountain lions, but there were no signs of animal attacks, and it would be highly unusual for predators to kill an entire family without leaving any evidence behind. The most persistent theory involved foul play. Perhaps the Scotts had encountered someone dangerous during their stay at the cabin, or maybe they had been targeted specifically. But who would want to harm a suburban family from Iowa? Michael's work as an accountant didn't involve any high-stakes clients or dangerous situations. Sarah's job as a teacher was equally benign. The twins were just children. There was simply no motive that anyone could identify. Still, investigators looked into everyone who had access to the cabin, previous renters, maintenance workers, local residents, but every lead led nowhere. The case generated significant media attention for several months. The story of a family vanishing on the eve of the new millennium captured the public imagination, and the Scotts' disappearance was featured on several television shows about unsolved mysteries. Tips poured in from all over the country, claimed sightings of the family in different states, theories from amateur investigators, and psychics who claimed to know what had happened. Every lead was investigated, but none produced any concrete evidence. Gradually, as other news stories took precedence and no new information emerged, public interest in the case began to fade. By 2005, the active investigation had essentially ended. The case file remained open, but with no new evidence and no fresh leads, there was little more that law enforcement could do. The Scotts were declared legally dead in 2007, though their bodies were never found. Their house in Cedar Rapids was sold, and their belongings were distributed among relatives. Michael's brother took custody of the family's golden retriever Max, who had been boarded at a kennel during their planned vacation. Even Max seemed to sense something was wrong. The normally friendly dog became withdrawn and would often sit by the window as if waiting for his family to return. The rental cabin changed hands several times over the years. Some owners tried to capitalize on its notoriety, marketing it as the site of a famous mystery, but most guests found the association too unsettling. The place developed a reputation for being haunted, with renters reporting strange noises, cold spots, and the feeling of being watched. Property managers had difficulty keeping it rented, and eventually it sat empty for long periods. The forest began to reclaim it, with vines growing up the walls and small animals making homes in the neglected structure. I became involved with the case in 2010 when I was hired by a true crime documentary crew to investigate several cold cases from the previous decade. The Scott family disappearance was one of the cases we examined, and I spent weeks in the mountains, interviewing locals and re-examining the evidence. I walked the same trails the search parties had covered, studied the terrain around the cabin, and talked to everyone who had been involved in the original investigation. I found no new evidence, but the case haunted me. There was something about the complete absence of clues that felt wrong, as if an important piece of the puzzle was missing. Years passed, and I moved on to other cases, but I never forgot about the Scotts. I kept their file on my desk, and occasionally I would pull it out and review the evidence, hoping to see something that previous investigators had missed. The case had become personal for me, not just because of the mystery, but because of what the family represented: ordinary people living ordinary lives who had simply vanished without explanation. If it could happen to them, it could happen to anyone. In March 2012, everything changed. The catalyst was an 11-year-old boy named David Martinez, whose family had recently purchased a house about 2 miles from the old rental cabin. David was the kind of kid who couldn't sit still, always exploring and looking for adventure. The Martinez family had bought the property as a weekend retreat, planning to fix it up and eventually retire there. The house was old and needed significant work, but it sat on beautiful land with a view of the mountains and a small creek running through the backyard. David discovered the bunker by accident. He was playing in the woods behind the house, following the creek and looking for interesting rocks, when he noticed what looked like a metal hatch, partially hidden under years of accumulated leaves and debris. The hatch was about 3 feet square and set into what appeared to be a concrete foundation buried in the hillside. It was painted olive green, though the paint was chipped and faded, and there was a heavy metal handle that required significant effort to turn. At first, David tried to open the hatch by himself, but it was too heavy and seemed to be locked or rusted shut. He ran back to the house and told his father, Miguel Martinez, about his discovery. Miguel was initially skeptical. His 11-year-old son had quite an imagination and was always finding treasure in the woods. But David was insistent, and eventually Miguel agreed to take a look. When he saw the hatch, Miguel realized this was no childhood fantasy. Someone had built a genuine underground structure on his property, and he had no idea what might be inside. Miguel brought tools from his workshop and spent the better part of an afternoon working to open the hatch. The hinges were rusted, and there appeared to be some kind of locking mechanism that had corroded over time. When he finally managed to pry it open, a musty smell rose from the darkness below, along with a current of cool air that suggested the space was larger than expected. Miguel peered into the opening with a flashlight and saw a metal ladder leading down into what looked like a small underground room. The walls were lined with concrete, and the space appeared to be about 10 feet square and 8 feet high. What Miguel saw at the bottom of the bunker changed everything we thought we knew about the Scott family disappearance. Scattered across the concrete floor were several backpacks and duffel bags, their contents spilled out as if they had been hastily searched through. There were clothes, adult and children's sizes, along with personal items, toiletries, and what looked like camping equipment. Miguel called the local sheriff's department, and when deputies arrived and descended into the bunker, they found items that would soon be identified as belonging to the missing Scott family. The backpacks contained clothing that matched descriptions of what the Scotts had been wearing when they disappeared. Emma's pink sweater was there, along with Jake's favorite dinosaur t-shirt. Sarah's reading glasses were tangled up in a pile of adult clothing, and Michael's wallet was found in one of the duffel bags, though the cash and credit cards were missing. There were also items that hadn't been mentioned in the original missing persons report: camping gear, hiking boots in various sizes, and several bottles of water and energy bars. It appeared the family had been prepared for some kind of outdoor activity when they disappeared. But the most disturbing discovery was what the investigators found tucked into a side pocket of one of the backpacks. It was Emma's drawing pad, the same one that had been found open on the coffee table in the rental cabin 12 years earlier. Except now it contained drawings that hadn't been there before, sketches of what looked like an underground room, drawings of metal bars, and images of stick figures that appeared to be trapped or confined. The drawings were crude, as you would expect from an 8-year-old, but the subject matter was chilling. One drawing showed what appeared to be a family of 4 stick figures standing behind bars, with the word "help" written in a child's uncertain handwriting. The discovery of the bunker sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community and reignited public interest in the Scott family case. The FBI was called in to assist with the investigation, and the underground space was processed as a crime scene. Forensic specialists found evidence that people had been held in the bunker for an extended period: makeshift bedding, human waste, scratches on the walls that appeared to be made by fingernails, and traces of DNA that would later be matched to the Scott family members. The bunker itself was a mystery. It appeared to have been built decades earlier, possibly during the Cold War era, when some Americans constructed private fallout shelters in remote areas. The construction was professional, with reinforced concrete walls and a ventilation system that was no longer operational. There were mounting points on the walls where equipment had once been attached, and electrical conduits that suggested the space had once been wired for power and lighting. However, by the time the Scotts would have been imprisoned there, the bunker was dark, damp, and had become more of a tomb than a shelter. The investigation revealed that the bunker had been modified at some point after its original construction. Metal bars had been welded across what appeared to be a second entrance, and there were signs that the original ladder had been replaced with a newer one. Most significantly, investigators found evidence that the hatch had been modified with an internal locking mechanism that could only be operated from the outside. Once someone was trapped inside the bunker, there was no way to escape without outside assistance. As the forensic investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. The evidence suggested that the Scott family had been held in the bunker for several weeks, possibly months. The children's drawings indicated a progression of time. Early sketches showed the family together, but later drawings depicted fewer stick figures, suggesting that family members had died or been removed from the bunker at different times. The final drawings in Emma's pad were almost incomprehensible scribbles, as if drawn by someone who was severely traumatized or physically weakened. The question that haunted everyone involved in the investigation was how the Scott family had ended up in the bunker in the first place. The timeline didn't make sense. They had disappeared from a rental cabin several miles away, and there was no evidence that they had ever been to the Martinez property. Had they been kidnapped from the cabin and transported to the bunker? If so, by whom? And why hadn't anyone heard their cries for help? The bunker was only about a quarter-mile from the nearest road, and while the Martinez property was isolated, it wasn't completely remote. The investigation expanded to include a thorough search of the area around the bunker. Ground-penetrating radar was used to search for additional underground structures or buried remains. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search for any trace of human remains on the property. The search teams found additional evidence of the Scott family's presence: fragments of clothing buried in shallow graves, personal items that had apparently been discarded in the woods, and what appeared to be a makeshift campsite about half a mile from the bunker, but they never found the bodies. Despite extensive searches of the surrounding area, the remains of Michael, Sarah, Emma, and Jake Scott were never recovered. The evidence suggested they had died in or near the bunker, but what had happened to their bodies remained a mystery. Had they been buried in a location that investigators hadn't found? Had they been moved to another location entirely? Or was there something even more sinister at work? The discovery of the bunker answered some questions about the Scott family. Disappearance, but it raised many more. Who had built the bunker's modifications? Who had kidnapped the family and held them prisoner? How had 4 people been taken from a rental cabin without anyone seeing or hearing anything suspicious? And perhaps most importantly, what had ultimately happened to their remains? The case that had been cold for over a decade was suddenly active again, but the new evidence seemed to deepen the mystery rather than solve it. As I write this, the investigation into the Scott family disappearance continues. The discovery of the bunker has provided concrete evidence that the family was murdered, but it has not led to the identification of their killer or killers. The case remains one of the most disturbing unsolved mysteries I've ever encountered, not just because of what happened to the Scotts, but because of how completely their killer managed to cover his tracks. Somewhere out there, someone knows what really happened during those final weeks of 1999 and the early months of 2000. Someone knows who built those modifications to the bunker, who kidnapped the Scott family, and what ultimately became of their remains. The Martinez family still owns the property where the bunker was discovered, though they've never spent another night there. David Martinez, now in his early 20s, says he still has nightmares about what he found in the woods that day. The bunker has been sealed by law enforcement, but its presence continues to haunt everyone who knows the full story of what was discovered there. The case file remains active, and investigators continue to follow up on leads and tips from the public. But as the years pass and memories fade, the likelihood of solving this case grows smaller. What happened to the Scott family in the final days of 1999? Were they random victims of a predator who had prepared that underground prison in advance? Or were they specifically targeted for reasons we still don't understand? The evidence suggests they survived for weeks or possibly months in that concrete tomb, sustained by whoever held them prisoner, but ultimately doomed to die in darkness and despair. The children's drawings tell a story of hope gradually turning to fear, and finally to something worse than fear, the terrible understanding that no help was coming. But the investigation took an even darker turn in late 2012, when forensic analysis of the bunker revealed details that still make my blood run cold. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit had been studying the crime scene for months, trying to build a profile of the perpetrator. What they discovered challenged everything we thought we knew about random crime. This wasn't the work of an opportunistic predator who stumbled upon a vulnerable family. This was something far more calculated, more personal, and infinitely more disturbing. The forensic team found evidence that the bunker had been prepared specifically for the Scott family weeks, possibly months, before their disappearance. Personal items belonging to the family, items that should have been in their Cedar Rapids home, were found in the bunker's walls, sealed behind false panels that had been carefully constructed. A family photo from Emma's birthday party earlier that year was discovered wrapped in plastic and hidden in a cavity behind the concrete. Jake's report card from school, dated just 2 months before the disappearance, was found in the same hiding spot. Most chilling of all was a copy of Sarah's teaching schedule, with specific dates and times marked in red ink. Someone had been watching the Scott family for months. Someone had gained access to their home, their personal belongings, their private lives. The perpetrator hadn't just kidnapped them on a whim during their vacation. He had studied them, planned for them, and prepared their underground prison with meticulous care. The modification to the bunker, the internal locking mechanism, the removal of the electrical systems, all of it had been done with the Scotts specifically in mind. This realization transformed the case from a random crime into something that resembled a carefully orchestrated execution. The investigation expanded to examine every aspect of the Scott family's lives in the months leading up to their disappearance. Detectives interviewed neighbors, co-workers, teachers, and family members, looking for anyone who might have had unusual access to the family or shown excessive interest in their activities. They reviewed security footage from the school where Sarah worked, examined Michael's client files, and even investigated contractors who had done work on their house. The search was exhaustive, but it revealed no obvious suspects. However, one name kept appearing in the periphery of the investigation: Leonard Marsh, a former maintenance worker who had been employed by the rental agency that managed the mountain cabin. Marsh had been fired from his position in early 1999, several months before the Scott family's disappearance, for what his supervisor described as inappropriate behavior and boundary issues with renters. The firing had been low-key, with no formal complaints filed and no police involvement. But when investigators tracked down Marsh in 2012, they discovered he had vanished from his last known address over a year earlier, leaving behind only unpaid bills and a landlord who described him as creepy and obsessed with other people's business. Marsh's background painted the picture of a man whose life had been defined by failure and resentment. He was in his mid-40s at the time of the Scott disappearance, divorced, with no children and few friends. He'd worked a series of maintenance and custodial jobs over the years, but was frequently fired for violating privacy boundaries, reading personal mail, going through guests' belongings, and in one case, being caught photographing the contents of someone's suitcase. His former co-workers described him as intelligent but strange, someone who seemed to know too much about other people's lives and took an unhealthy interest in families, particularly families with young children. The rental agency's record showed that Marsh had serviced the mountain cabin multiple times in the months before he was fired. He would have had access to the property, knowledge of its isolated location, and familiarity with the surrounding area. More importantly, he would have known about the cabin's rental schedule and could have easily identified families who were planning to stay there. The timing of his termination, several months before the Scott disappearance, but recent enough that he would still have detailed knowledge of the property, made him a person of significant interest to investigators. But Marsh remained a ghost. Despite extensive efforts by law enforcement, including federal marshals and international cooperation through Interpol, no trace of Leonard Marsh could be found after 2011. His social security number hadn't been used, his driver's license had expired and not been renewed, and he had made no contact with any known associates or family members. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist, just like the Scott family had 12 years earlier. The parallel was not lost on investigators, who suspected that Marsh's disappearance might be connected to the discovery of the bunker. In early 2013, the investigation received new impetus when a hiker found what appeared to be a makeshift camp about 5 miles from the bunker site. The camp consisted of a small tent, camping supplies, and personal items that suggested someone had been living rough in the mountains for an extended period. Among the items found were notebooks filled with obsessive writings about surveillance techniques, detailed maps of the area around the old rental cabin, and most disturbingly, newspaper clippings about the Scott family disappearance dating from 1999 to 2012. The handwriting in the notebooks was eventually matched to Leonard Marsh through samples obtained from his employment records. The notebooks revealed the mind of someone consumed by the Scott case, but not from the perspective of someone seeking justice or trying to solve the mystery. Instead, the writing showed a person who seemed to be reliving the crime, analyzing what had gone wrong, and planning improvements for future victims. There were detailed critiques of how the original investigation had been conducted, notes about evidence that had been missed, and most chillingly, lists of other families who had stayed at remote rental properties in the area. The camp appeared to have been abandoned hastily, with food still in cans and personal belongings scattered as if the occupant had left quickly and never planned to return. Carbon dating of organic materials found at the site suggested the camp had been used intermittently over several years, with the most recent activity occurring sometime in late 2012, just months after the bunker discovery had been made public. Investigators theorized that Marsh had been monitoring the investigation from his mountain hideout, watching as his carefully constructed crime scene was uncovered and analyzed. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery at the campsite was what investigators found buried under the tent floor. Wrapped in plastic and sealed in a waterproof container were dozens of photographs taken with a telephoto lens, showing families at various rental properties throughout the region. The photos spanned several years and included images of children playing, parents relaxing, and families engaged in ordinary vacation activities. Each family had been documented extensively, with notes about their routines, their vulnerabilities, and their planned length of stay. The Scott family appeared in more than 50 photographs, dating from several months before their disappearance to the day they arrived at the mountain cabin. The images showed an escalating pattern of surveillance. Early photos were taken from a distance and showed the family at their home in Cedar Rapids. But later, images were taken much closer, showing intimate family moments and even shots taken through the windows of their house. The final photographs in the series showed the Scotts arriving at the mountain cabin on December 30th, 1999, and included images of the family unloading their car and entering the cabin for the last time. The discovery of Marsh's camp and the photographic evidence definitively linked him to the Scott family's disappearance, but it also revealed that the Scotts were not his only victims. The photographs showed at least a dozen other families who had been under surveillance, and investigators realized with growing horror that they might be dealing with a serial predator who had been operating in the area for years. The revelation prompted a massive review of missing persons cases throughout the region, looking for other families or individuals who had disappeared under similar circumstances. The review uncovered several cases that bore striking similarities to the Scott disappearance. Families or couples who had vanished while staying at remote rental properties, cases where personal belongings were left behind but the victims were never found, and instances where initial investigations had been hampered by the isolated locations and delayed discovery of the disappearances. While none of these cases had generated the same level of media attention as the Scott disappearance, the pattern was unmistakable once investigators knew what to look for. Most disturbing was the case of the Hendricks family from Oregon, who had disappeared in 1997 while staying at a cabin about 40 miles from the Scott rental property. Like the Scotts, they had vanished without a trace, leaving behind their belongings and their car. The case had gone cold after an extensive but fruitless search of the surrounding wilderness. Among the photographs found at Marsh's campsite were several images of the Hendricks family, taken during what appeared to be surveillance of their cabin rental. The connection suggested that Marsh had been perfecting his methods for years before he encountered the Scott family. The investigation into Leonard Marsh and his possible connection to multiple disappearances continued for months, but despite the compelling evidence linking him to the crimes, investigators faced a fundamental problem. They still had no physical evidence of what had ultimately happened to the victims. The bunker had revealed that the Scott family had been held prisoner and had eventually died in captivity, but their remains had never been found. Without bodies, without a living suspect, and without witnesses, the case remained technically unsolved. In late 2013, the active investigation into the Scott family disappearance was officially suspended, though the case file remained open and investigators continued to follow up on any new leads that emerged. The bunker was permanently sealed, and the Martinez property was eventually sold to a developer who planned to build vacation homes in the area. The new owners were fully informed about the property's history, but the combination of beautiful mountain views and relatively affordable land prices proved attractive to buyers who were willing to overlook the dark events that had occurred there. David Martinez, the boy who had discovered the bunker, graduated from high school and moved away from the mountains. But the experience had left permanent scars on his psyche. In interviews years later, He would describe recurring nightmares about what he had found that day and a persistent fear that whoever had created that underground prison might still be out there, watching and waiting for his next victims. His family moved away from the mountain property within a year of the discovery, unable to live with the knowledge of what had been hidden beneath their land. The Scott family case became a subject of academic study for forensic psychologists and criminal profilers, who saw it as a textbook example of how a methodical predator could operate undetected for years in remote areas. The case highlighted the vulnerabilities of families who choose isolated vacation rentals and led to increased security measures and background checks for employees of rental property management companies. But for all the lessons learned and procedures implemented, the fundamental questions about what happened to the Scott family remained unanswered. As I conclude this investigation, more than a decade after the bunker discovery, I'm left with the unsettling knowledge that Leonard Marsh was never found, was never prosecuted, and may still be alive. The photographic evidence suggests he was responsible for multiple disappearances over a period of years, and there's no reason to believe he stopped killing after the Scott case gained renewed attention in 2012. He may have simply moved to a different area, found new hunting grounds, and continued his pattern of stalking and murdering innocent families who thought they were enjoying a peaceful vacation in the mountains. The Scott family deserved better than this. Michael and Sarah deserved to watch their children grow up, to see Emma develop her artistic talents and Jake explore the natural world he loved so much. The twins deserved to have normal childhoods, to go to school and make friends and discover who they would become as adults. Instead, they ended their lives in darkness and terror, victims of a predator who had turned their family vacation into a nightmare from which they would never wake. Their story serves as a reminder that evil can lurk in the most beautiful places, and that sometimes the monsters we fear in our darkest imagination are all too real. What do you think really happened to the Scott family during those final weeks in the bunker? Do you believe Leonard Marsh was responsible for their disappearance, or is there another explanation for the evidence found at the crime scene? And perhaps most importantly, if Marsh is still alive, how many other families have suffered the same fate as the Scotts? Leave your theories in the comments below, because somewhere out there, someone might hold the key to finally solving this case and bringing justice to the Scott family.